you go along to the history of psychedelics to unpack the kind of the relevant questions around the kind of religious freedom and these legal issues. So if we focus on, obviously in indigenous uses, substances have been used for a very long time, but in the West, LSD was the thing that kind of burst onto the scene in the mid 20th century. And so maybe you can tell us a bit about how LSD first kind of escaped the laboratories and the clinics and got into kind of underground use.
Well, it's really interesting because the answer to that wasn't really the underground chemists or the black market at first. It was actually the researchers who were handling these substances. Now, in the 50s, in the 1950s, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals was the only distributor of LSD and related medications. They had a foothold on the control. There weren't really any other people making it. They were distributing it only to qualified researchers who were using it as an adjunct in psychotherapy, not only as a diagnostic aid, but as a pharmacological tool to elicit the servicing of subconscious material, which could be addressed and integrated in subsequent talk therapy sessions. But at a certain point, researchers began to realize that those who were best qualified to administer these medicines to patients were those researchers who had taken the medicines themselves. Essentially, the idea was that if they were to be familiar with the subjective effects of these medications, they could better understand how to utilize them when administering them to patients. So in effect, they would often administer LSD, DMT, mescaline, psilocybin, ethnosibin, or other analogs to themselves. Beyond this, they wanted to better understand the lived experiences of their patients who had dealt with various mental illnesses. The prevailing notion at the time was that LSD could induce or mimic a form of psychosis or schizophrenia, so described by the now defunct and obsolete term psychotomimetic. By the end of the 50s, the term began to face backlash for its lack of accuracy, and the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, took its place. Now, by 1960, LSD research was coming along well, and there were dozens of researchers who had grown to enjoy the subjective effects of LSD, not because it induced some sort of enjoyable psychosis or narcotic type haze, but because I guess the way that they might describe it was that it was intellectually stimulating. So these people would begin to take their supply of delicid home and share it with their colleagues, their friends at relaxed evening parties. There's one really famous incident where you might know this, where a British dentist, you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, Michael something.
No,
Is it,
Dr.
is it
Robert. He
someone
had
else? Oh, of course. Yeah.
yes,
Immortalized in the Beatles
yeah,
song.
surreptitiously dosed John Lennon and George Harrison with purified LSD. It was later immortalized in that song, Dr. Robert. Harrison later reflected on the event, and at the time, oh boy, he didn't even know what LSD was or what these subjective effects were, and I can't even imagine what that experience must have been like. But anyway, somehow throughout the course of the evening, they went to a local concert. They'd driven there themselves, and in the wee hours of the morning had driven back to their hotel, luckily without incident. But people like Dr. Sidney Cohen, who was the director of the Division of Narcotic Division at the National Institute of Mental Health, he had made public statements, public notices about the fact that these researchers were diverting their supply of delicid and psilocybin to their friends and saying, wagging his finger, saying, this is going to become a problem. It's going to get into the black market at some point. And soon enough, it did. Positive press coverage of LSD research in the early 60s led to increased demand in the black market. So several clandestine chemists began to learn the very complex method of synthesizing LSD. Compared to other synthetic drugs, such as, let's say, methamphetamine, LSD synthesis is incredibly tedious and requires extensive knowledge of organic chemistry. So a lot of the early synthesis attempts were just utter failures. But the first documented LSD bust came in early 1963. when Bernard Copley and Bernard Roseman sold LSD to an undercover agent, Eek. They were tipped off by a researcher, Myron Stolaroff, to those who know him. So these two Bernies were actually charged with violating the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962. That amendment, among other things, prohibited the mislabeling of medications. So they weren't technically charged with possession of LSD. They were charged with a technical violation of the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. At the time, there weren't any laws which prohibited the possession of LSD. So, yeah. Copley and Roseman weren't the only two LSD chemists at the time. There were plenty of others, but because of the fact that law enforcement wasn't able to catch them, we don't really know who most of them were. But the next really big player on the scene was Owsley Stanley, known as Bear. This chemist began to synthesize LSD in 1963. He was actually inspired by the Bernie Bros, as I call them. But he started synthesizing LSD, and by 65, get this, he was busted, but he was charged with illicit manufacture of methamphetamine. And because the analyses of the laboratory materials that were seized indicated that he wasn't synthesizing methamphetamine, the charges against him were dropped. And not only that, he successfully sued for the return of his lab equipment. So he got everything back, moved everything over to California, and started hooking up with, you might have known them, Nick Sand and Tim Scully. They really began to churn out LSD and other tryptamine, phenethylamine analogs. The thing that really got them going was the fact that they were able to distribute their materials sell their materials to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, who had the network to distribute these materials all across the country. So yeah, while there were many small-time LSD dealers in the San Francisco scene, it was the Hells Angels who actually got it across the nation. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love also had a hand to play in it, but that's another story unto itself. Now, one story is related to adverse reactions from LSD, and these analogs began to appear in the newspapers. It really began to accelerate the public concern. Not only was LSD being sold, there was another material called a DOM. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Essentially, it was first synthesized in 1963 by Alexander Sasha Shulgin. And because he had shared the method of its synthesis with, I believe it was Stanley. It might have been Scully or Sand. It was one of them. But they had gotten a hold of the synthesis and decided to start making DOM. It's a substituted amphetamine, which has effects which border somewhere between amphetamine and mescaline. It has effects which last for about 72 hours. And unfortunately, because the drug has a delayed onset, a lot of people thought that the material was just weak LSD, so they doubled or tripled their dose. And before they knew it, they wound up in the ER reporting anxiety, hallucinations, tremors. Not a really good scene because doctors didn't know how to treat it at the time. Chlorpromazine had been used to successfully treat LSD overdoses, but doctors quickly realized that chlorpromazine was contraindicated with SCP overdoses. And to add on to this, if people reported that it was actually that they had taken STP, that was the street name for it, short for Serenity, Tranquility, and Peace. Doctors didn't know what that was. They didn't know that it was DOM, that it was a substituted amphetamine. So they were literally working with patients who didn't even know what they took. It was a really bad scene. So all in all, this quickly led to an escalating public concern for what was going on over in San Francisco and beyond.